Solomon River Valley, Kansas, September 1884. The cottonwoods along the river had turned a brittle, buttery yellow, and the air carried the first clean hint of frost. On the plains, this was the season of final preparation, of banking sod against foundations and chinking the last gaps in cabin walls with a mixture of mud and prairie grass. It was a season of hammering, sawing, and stacking. But Andre Munteanu was not hammering, he was stitching. With a heavy sailmaker's needle and waxed linen thread, he sat on a low stool, his back to the wind, methodically sewing together enormous, lumpy quilts. They were not for a bed, they were for his house. The filling was a mountain of greasy, unwashed sheep's wool, pungent and rich with lanolin, bought for a pittance from herders moving their flocks south. His wife, Elena, carded the fleece just enough to give it loft, then packed it 3 inches thick between sheets of rough canvas. Otis Brundage, the owner of the lumber yard and the closest thing the valley had to a building authority, pulled his wagon to a stop on the track that passed Munteanu's claim. He was a man built of the same solid, unyielding stuff as the oak logs he sold. He watched for a long moment, a look of profound disbelief on his face. "Munteanu," he called out, his voice carrying easily in the clear air. "What in God's name are you doing? Are you making a bed jacket for your cabin?" A few other men, Silas Croft and Jebediah Stone among them, stopped their own work to watch the spectacle. They leaned on their tools, sharing smirks. Andre looked up, squinting into the sun. He gave a slight nod. "Something like that." Brundage got down from his wagon, walking over to inspect one of the finished quilts. He poked it with a thick finger. "This is wool, man. Raw wool. You nail this to your house and you're begging for trouble. The first wet spring we get, that whole mess will rot into a stinking green slime right against your planks. Moths will breed in it by the 1,000. Your children will be coughing up wool dust all winter. Mark my words," Brundage declared, his voice rising for the benefit of the listening men. "Your wife will have you tearing it all off by June, if the smell don't drive you out first." "He's gone mad," Croft muttered to Stone, loud enough for Andre to hear. "Wrapping a house in a sheep's pelt? It's foolishness." Andre Munteanu simply pulled his thread taut, tied a knot with the practiced economy of a man who had done it 10,000 times, and reached for the next section of canvas. He said nothing more, letting the quiet rhythm of his work be his only answer. The mockery was a language he understood, but it was not one he chose to speak. What did this Romanian kojokar, this sheepskin coat maker, understand about the physics of a trapped air fiber matrix that a master of saw logs and milled planks, a man who had built half the structures in the valley, had so completely missed? The answer to that question would change how this corner of the Kansas prairie survived the winter. It's a story of quiet genius, of old-world knowledge meeting new-world problems. And if you stick with me, I promise you'll learn the fundamental principle of insulation that Munteanu understood in his bones, a principle that modern building science is only now perfecting. So subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments. What's the coldest winter you can remember, and how did your family home stand up to it? Andre Munteanu was not a carpenter. He had never felled a tree to build a home, never learned the intricate art of the dovetail joint or the proper way to set a foundation stone. In his homeland, in the shadow of the Carpathian Mountains, houses were made of stone and plaster, built to last for generations. He was not a farmer either. He knew the rhythm of sheep, not of wheat. The vast oceanic scale of a Kansas wheat field was as alien to him as the surface of the moon. He was an outsider, a man whose hands held a different kind of knowledge. He was a kojokar, a maker of the heavy, fleece-lined sheepskin coats that kept shepherds alive in the brutal, wind-scoured winters of the high mountains. His tools were not the axe and the adze, but the scraper, the heavy shear, the curved needle, and the smoothing stone. His raw materials were not logs but hides, not nails but sinew and waxed thread, not milled planks but the dense, crimped, lanolin-soaked fleece of the Circana sheep. For 20 years he had worked with the singular goal of keeping a man's body heat from escaping into a frozen world. He understood that the enemy wasn't just the cold, but the wind that carried the cold, and the damp that invited it in. He knew how to layer cured hide over thick fleece, stitching them so that the seams themselves were waterproof, sealing them with rendered tallow and birch tar. He knew that the secret to warmth wasn't thickness, but stillness. He had brought his wife, Elena, and their 2 children, Mihai and Sophia, to Kansas for the promise of land, a place to build a life, not just survive one. But their first winter in the hastily built plank cabin had been a brutal education in the physics of failure. The land was generous, but the sky was cruel. That winter had nearly broken them. It wasn't the dramatic blizzards that were the worst, but the relentless, invasive cold that seeped through the very fabric of their shelter. Andrei remembered watching, by the flickering light of a single kerosene lamp, as a delicate lacework of frost climbed the mud chinking between the logs, growing visibly, glittering like a malevolent jewel. He remembered the nail heads on the interior walls, driven clean through the planks from the outside, each one wearing a perfect white cap of rime, miniature icebergs conducting the killing cold directly into their living space. Elena would mix her sourdough starter and place it on the warming shelf above the cast iron stove, the warmest spot in the entire cabin, only to find it the next morning as a cold, lifeless lump. The dough simply refused to rise. They had spent that winter huddled together in one bed, buried under every blanket and coat they owned, sleeping in shifts to feed a voracious stove that consumed wood at an astonishing rate, yet offered only a small circle of heat in return. Young Sophia had developed a persistent, rattling cough that had terrified them for weeks. That winter, Andrei learned that a Kansas cabin was not a shelter. It was a sieve, and he vowed he would not let his family endure another season like it. The problem, as Andrei came to understand it, wasn't poor construction. In fact, by the standards of the Solomon River Valley, his neighbors' homes were built well. Otis Brundage's own house, a 2-story affair made from the finest, thickest planks his own yard could produce, was considered a fortress against the weather. The joints were tight, the chinking was fresh, and the foundation was solid. Yet, on a 10-degree day, the Brundage family lived in a state of constant thermal siege. The conventional wisdom of the frontier was simple. A thicker wall was a warmer wall. If cold was getting in, you needed more wood. But this was a fundamental misunderstanding of the enemy. The problem wasn't the cold getting in, it was the heat getting out. The primary mechanism of failure was conduction. A solid material, like a pine plank, is a relatively dense structure of fibers. When one side of the plank is warm, the interior of the cabin, heated by the stove, the molecules in the wood vibrate with energy. They bump into their neighbors, passing that energy along, which in turn bump into their neighbors. This chain reaction continues straight through the solid plank until the energy reaches the outside surface, where it radiates away into the freezing air. Wood felt warm to the touch compared to stone or iron, but over the course of hours and days, it was a slow-motion highway for heat loss. A standard 1-inch thick pine plank has an R value, a measure of its resistance to heat flow, of about R1. A well-built cabin wall of 4-inch thick logs might achieve an R value of 4 or 5. This was simply not enough to combat the immense temperature differential of a Kansas winter, where the inside might be 60 degrees Fahrenheit and the outside could be 20 below zero. The result was a brutal, inefficient cycle. Families like the Cartwrights and the Millers would feed their stoves constantly, burning through enormous stacks of precious cottonwood. The stove would heat the air inside the cabin, and that warm air would immediately begin its frantic search for an escape route. It found one everywhere, through the walls, through the ceiling, through the floor. The interior surfaces of the walls were always cold to the touch. Any moisture in the air, from breathing, from cooking, would instantly condense on these cold surfaces and freeze, creating that interior frost Andre knew so well. It was a battle you could never win, only fight to a costly stalemate until spring. The settlers were trying to solve the problem with more fire. Andre Munteanu knew the solution lay not in making more heat, but in keeping the heat he already had. The work began in earnest as the mockery from his neighbors settled into a kind of resigned pity. Andre ignored it. He had a different authority to answer to, the memory of his daughter's cough. His first step was acquiring the material. He rode his mule to the sheep camps, where shearers were taking the last clip before winter. He didn't want the expensive clean fleece destined for eastern mills. He wanted the cast-offs, the greasy, burr-filled belly and leg wool that was often discarded. It was heavy with lanolin, the natural grease that waterproofs a sheep's coat, and it was cheap. He bought hundreds of pounds of it for a few dollars, hauling it back in burlap sacks. The whole family was put to work. On warm, sunny afternoons, Elena would supervise Mihai and Sophia as they washed the wool in tubs of hot water and lye soap, getting the worst of the dirt out but leaving much of the protective lanolin behind. Then, they spread it on canvas sheets to dry in the sun. The air around their small claim took on the gamey, earthy scent of a sheepfold. Once dry, the wool was carded. Using 2 wire-toothed paddles, Elena and Andre combed the fleece, not to the fine, uniform consistency of spinning wool, but just enough to break up the clumps and create a light, airy mass of crisscrossing fibers. This, Andre knew, was the most critical step. He was weaving a web not of wool, but of air. Then came the stitching. Andre laid out long sheets of heavy, cheap canvas he'd bought from a freight hauler. He and Elena packed the carded wool between 2 layers, creating a thick 3-inch sandwich. Then, using his heavy Koyakar's needle, he began stitching a simple grid pattern across the entire quilt, every 6 inches, to keep the wool from settling or bunching. It was slow, laborious work. Each quilt measuring 4 feet by 8 feet took the better part of a day to complete. As he finished them, he began attaching them to the cabin. Starting at the bottom, just above the stone foundation, he nailed the top edge of the first quilt directly to the plank wall. The next quilt was placed above it, overlapping the first by 6 inches, like a giant, soft shingle. He worked his way up the walls, course by course, until the entire cabin was wrapped in a thick, lumpy, gray-brown blanket. The sharp corners of the cabin were gone, replaced by soft, rounded edges. It looked less like a house, and more like some strange prairie animal that had hunkered down for winter. Otis Brundage rode by again during this phase. "It's the damnedest thing I've ever seen," he said to Jebediah Stone, who was with him. "Looks like a giant's pillow." He turned to Andre. "You realize all you're doing is building a nest for mice and pack rats, Munteanu? They'll tunnel through that in a week and be snug in your walls all winter long, chewing on your food stores." Andre paused, holding a nail in his teeth. "The sheep do not have this problem," he said, his voice muffled. He drove the nail home. The final step was the most bizarre to onlookers. In a large iron pot over an open fire, Andre melted down gallons of pine tar, the sticky black residue used for waterproofing ropes and fence posts. When it was hot and liquid, he used a wide, stiff brush and began to paint his house. He slathered the hot tar over the entire surface of the wool and canvas quilts, forcing it into the seams and over the canvas faces. The cabin turned from lumpy gray to a gleaming, malevolent black. The tar sealed every tiny hole, creating a continuous, waterproof, and windproof skin. Before the tar could cool and harden, he nailed long, thin wooden slats, battens, over every seam, both horizontal and vertical, pinning the edges of the quilts down and creating a final, rigid exoskeleton. When he was done, the cabin was unrecognizable. It was a monolithic black form, its texture rough and alien. The windows and door looked like holes punched into a solid block of coal. It absorbed the autumn sunlight without reflection. It was ugly, strange, and to the people of the Solomon River Valley, the ultimate monument to one man's foolishness. The genius of Andre's design was not in the wool itself, but in what the wool did. The principle he understood from his years of making coats was simple: still air is one of the most effective insulators on the planet. The challenge is keeping it still. Heat moves in three ways: conduction, through direct contact; convection, through the movement of air or liquid; and radiation, through electromagnetic waves. A standard cabin wall fought a losing battle against conduction, but its bigger enemy was convection in the form of drafts. Cold air would find its way through 1,000 tiny gaps in the chinking and planks, while warm air would leak out. Andre's wool quilts attacked both problems. The wool fiber's unique structure was the key. Under a microscope, a single strand of wool is not smooth. It's covered in tiny overlapping scales and has a natural helical crimp. When thousands of these fibers are loosely packed together, this crimp and texture create a three-dimensional, chaotic matrix. This matrix is mostly empty space, millions upon millions of microscopic pockets of air. Because these pockets are so small, the air within them cannot move. It is trapped. It cannot form the circulating convection currents that transfer heat. This trapped, still air is the true insulator. The wool is merely the structure that holds it in place. By packing 3 inches of this fiber matrix against his walls, Andre had created a buffer of still air that was profoundly resistant to heat transfer. Quantitatively, the results were staggering. The R value of his original plank walls was, at best, R4. The R value of his 3-inch wool bat was approximately R12. He had effectively quadrupled the insulating capacity of his walls. He hadn't just added a layer, he had fundamentally changed the thermal dynamics of the structure. The final layer of tar and battens was equally crucial. It served as a primitive but highly effective air and moisture barrier. It stopped the wind completely, preventing it from penetrating the wool and disturbing the trapped air. It also shed rain and melting snow, keeping the wool dry. Wet insulation is useless insulation, because water is an excellent conductor of heat. The tar ensured that his trapped air matrix would remain dry and functional. The structure Brundage had dismissed as a rotting, vermin-infested mess was, in fact, a sophisticated, high-performance building envelope, perfectly adapted to its environment. That winter, the sky fell. In the second week of January, a mass of Arctic air, a phenomenon the old-timers called a Plains Arctic outbreak, slid down from Canada and settled over Kansas. It was not a storm. There was little snow and only a light, keening wind. It was a pure, crystalline cold. For 12 consecutive days, the temperature did not rise above 0, and at night it plunged to 30 below. The air was so brittle and clear, you could hear an axe striking wood a mile away. The sun rose each day as a pale, useless disk in a white sky, offering light but no warmth. It was a winter that tested every cabin, every family, every last scrap of firewood. The smoke rising from the chimneys in the valley was a constant, frantic plume. Inside Otis Brundage's well-built house, the fight was relentless. His wife stuffed rags into the gaps around the window sashes, but a visible frost still bloomed on the inside of the panes. They kept the big stove in the main room roaring, but the bedrooms remained dangerously cold. To move more than 10 feet from the stove was to enter a different Arctic climate zone. Every morning, their water bucket held a thick cap of ice. At the miller's cabin, they ran out of seasoned cottonwood and started burning green wood, which hissed and smoked but gave off little heat. Their youngest child was sick, and the cold in the cabin made his fever worse. The Cartwrights moved their bed into the main room and hung blankets around the stove, creating a miserable little tent within their own home. At the Munteanu claim, life continued with an almost surreal normalcy. Andre kept a small, steady fire in his stove, using less than half the wood his neighbors burned. The interior of his cabin was not just habitable, it was comfortable. The air was still and quiet. There were no drafts. The walls were not warm, but they were not cold. They felt neutral to the touch, having stolen none of the room's heat. Elena baked bread, and the loaves rose high and light on the warming shelf. The smell of fresh bread, a scent of impossible domesticity in the frozen landscape, filled the small space. Mihai and Sophia played on the floor in their shirt sleeves, building a small fort out of kindling. On the third night of the cold snap, Andre conducted a quiet experiment. He filled a simple tin cup with water and placed it on the sill of the north-facing window, the coldest part of the house. On the other side of that single pane of glass, the world was 30 degrees below zero. Inside any other cabin in the valley, that water would have been a solid block of ice within an hour. The next morning, as the pale sun rose, Andre checked the cup. The water was very cold, but it was still liquid. Every last drop. He picked it up and gave it to Elena, who used it to water a small pot of parsley she kept on the sill. That small green plant, alive and growing in the face of an Arctic onslaught, was the ultimate proof. Later that day, Andre heard that Silas Croft's water cup, left in a similar spot, had not only frozen solid, but the expanding ice had split the tin seam from top to bottom, creating a useless tube of metal around a clear ice plug. On the 8th day of the cold, near dusk, Otis Brundage was driving his sleigh home from a neighboring town. He was cold to the bone, his beard a mask of ice from his own breath. His big Clydesdale mare, Bess, was tired and irritable, her coat frosted with sweat. As they drew near the Munteanu claim, the horse suddenly balked. She stopped dead in the track, lowering her head and refusing to move. She had stopped in the lee of Andre's cabin, on the downwind side. She turned her body broadside to the strange black wall, seeking a shelter that made no sense. Brundage cursed and cracked the whip in the air. "Get on, you stubborn beast!" he yelled. The horse only shook her massive head and leaned closer to the house. Frustrated, Brundage wrapped the reins and climbed down from the sleigh. The cold hit him like a physical blow. He walked to the horse's head to coax her forward, his boots crunching on the crystalline snow. As he pulled on her bridle, he leaned his shoulder against the cabin wall for leverage. He expected to feel the familiar, soul-sucking cold of a plank wall, a cold that would leach the warmth right through his thick wool coat. Instead, he felt nothing. It was just a surface. No cold radiated from it. Puzzled, he placed his gloved hand flat against the tarred batten. Still nothing. A profound thermal neutrality. A strange curiosity pierced his misery. He pulled off his right glove, his fingers instantly aching in the frigid air. He hesitated for a second, then pressed his bare palm firmly against the rough, tarred canvas between two battens. The sensation sent a jolt through him. It was not warm, not like a stove, but it was undeniably radiating a faint, deep, and persistent warmth. It was the feeling of life. He was touching the retained heat of the Munteanu's small fire, heat that should have been lost to the ravenous cold hours ago. Here it was, held captive inside this ugly black skin, leaking out so slowly, so reluctantly, that a man's hand could feel it. The horse had felt it. She had recognized the impossible, a shelter that actually held warmth. He stood there for a full minute, his bare hand pressed against the wall, his mind struggling to reconcile what his senses were telling him with everything he thought he knew about building. He looked at the thin plume of smoke, rising lazily from the chimney, a mere whisper compared to the billowing torrents from every other cabin. He finally understood. Munteanu wasn't fighting the winter. He had made peace with it. Brundage pulled his hand away, the skin tingling. He didn't knock on the door. He didn't need to. He led the now willing horse away, his mind replaying that impossible sensation of warmth. The next morning he didn't approach Andre with an apology, but with the quiet reverence of a student approaching a master. "Tell me, Munteanu," he said, his voice stripped of all its old authority. "Tell me how you did it." Andre explained, simply and without triumph. He spoke of sheep and coats, of still air and waterproof skins. Brundage listened, nodding slowly. When the explanation was done, he looked back at the strange black cabin, no longer seeing an ugly, foolish object. He saw it for what it was. "My God, Munteanu," he said, his voice full of awe. "You didn't build a wall. You gave the house a fleece." The story of the warm cabins spread, but its most effective messenger was a man who traveled the valley by faith. Reverend Miller, a circuit-riding Methodist preacher, made his rounds regardless of the weather. One Sunday during the cold snap, his route brought him to the Munteanu claim for supper. He arrived half-frozen, expecting to spend the evening huddled by a stove. Instead, he walked into a cabin filled with an even, comfortable warmth. He took off his coat, then his sweater. He ate supper in his shirt sleeves, watching in amazement as the Munteanu children played on the floor. Reverend Miller was a practical man whose congregations were mostly poor sod-house dwellers. He understood the brutal calculus of winter survival on the plains. What he felt in Andre's home was not just comfort. It was a revelation. It was hope, wrapped in wool and tar. He left that evening with a full stomach and a simple, hand-drawn diagram. From Andre. At every Sunday supper, in every sod house and dugout along the Solomon River, he told the story. He described the liquid water in the tin cup, the rising bread, the children without coughs. He spoke of it as a form of stewardship, of using God's humble gifts, the fleece of the sheep, the sap of the pine, to protect one's family. For the sod house families who lived in homes that were damp and notoriously hard to heat, the idea was revolutionary. Wool was far cheaper and more available than lumber. By Easter, the idea had taken root. 7 families, inspired by the preacher's testimony and their own hard memories of January, had wrapped their homes, some plank, some sod, in their own versions of Munteanu's fleece. They reported their fuel consumption had been cut in half. The Munteanu wrap, as it came to be known, began its slow, quiet journey across the prairie. What Andre Munteanu accomplished with his wool, canvas, and tar was a brilliant, intuitive leap of engineering that anticipated modern building science by nearly a century. His stitched wool quilt was a direct ancestor of the fiberglass and mineral wool bat insulation found in homes today. The core principle, using a dense fiber matrix to trap air and slow the transfer of heat, is the foundation of all modern insulation technology. His tar and batten exterior was a primitive but effective version of a modern air barrier or house wrap, designed to protect the insulation and stop convective heat loss from wind. He had, without any formal training, created a high-performance building envelope. He saw a house not as a solid fortress, but as a body that needed a proper coat to survive. The great lesson of the frontier was often not one of invention, but of translation. Wisdom from one harsh climate, carried in the hands and mind of an outsider, could be adapted to solve the problems of another. Andre Munteanu brought the wisdom of a Carpathian shepherd to the plains of Kansas. He knew that the fiercest blizzard is powerless against a cushion of still air. The solution to the killing cold was not more fire, more wood, more brute force. It was stillness. It was quiet. Still air does not freeze. In the heart of that brutal Kansas winter, Andre Munteanu had simply taught his house how to hold its breath. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. We hope you found it as inspiring as we did. If you'd like to see more stories like this, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. And let us know in the comments. What other old world building techniques have you seen that work better than many modern methods? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Disclaimer: this video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. The application of any building technique today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.